Breaking. Ottawa declares Canada's fresh water a public trust. Exports are off the table. Welcome to Canada Next for detailed analysis. Officials warn exports would create dangerous dependency and harm ecosystems. Sovereignty comes first. Breaking tonight. The unthinkable just became negotiable. Donald Trump didn't suggest, he demanded. And Mark Carney's response didn't leave room for interpretation. It left Washington speechless. British Columbia received notification this week. The U.S. government paused negotiations on the Columbia River Treaty. Not delayed, paused. The stated reason, the current administration is reviewing its international engagements. But dear viewers, when you're talking about water treaties during the worst drought crisis in American history, that phrase means something very different. Translation: Washington is reassessing which water belongs to whom. Then Trump said it out loud. They have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north, with the snowcaps in Canada all pouring down. They have essentially a very large faucet. Not a resource, not a shared ecosystem, a faucet. And in that single word, everything changed. If you're realizing this story goes deeper than headlines suggest, you're exactly where you need to be. What you're watching unfold isn't a trade dispute. This is the opening move in North America's first water sovereignty crisis. And the fault line doesn't run through ideology or economics. It runs through rivers, lakes, and the invisible currents beneath the soil that both nations depend on to survive. Here's what makes this moment so dangerous. The United States and Canada have spent 2 centuries as the world's closest allies. Shared borders, integrated economies, military partnerships that defined global security. But now, for the first time since 1812, those 2 nations are staring at each other across a resource divide where one side is running out and the other side is saying no. Absolutely not. Not now, not ever. Let me show you how fast this escalated. January 15th, 2025. Trump addresses water scarcity during a campaign rally in Phoenix. He mentions Canada's abundance, calls it logical cooperation. The Canadian Embassy issues a polite statement about environmental stewardship. Standard diplomatic language. Nothing alarming. February 3rd. Trump repeats the idea during a press conference. This time he's more specific. Arizona, Nevada, California. They're heading toward crisis. Conservation won't solve it. Technology won't solve it. But Canada, he says, has more fresh water than it could ever use. Why not share? Ottawa's response comes within hours, and it's not polite anymore. Prime Minister Mark Carney holds an emergency press briefing. No prepared remarks, no diplomatic cushioning. He looks directly into the camera and says this: Canada's water is not a tradable commodity. It is a public trust, part of our identity, part of our environment. It is not for sale. It will never be for sale. That statement slammed the door, then locked it, then welded it shut for good measure. Across America, from Phoenix to Vegas to Los Angeles, people heard Carney's words and landed on the same uncomfortable question. Your most powerful nation on earth is running dry. Your closest neighbor just said, no. Now what? Here's the part Trump was actually pointing at. The Colorado River used to carve canyons. Now it barely reaches the ocean. Lake Mead has fallen so far that intake pipes built during the Great Depression are sitting in open air. California farmers are staring at land their families worked for generations, doing math that doesn't add up anymore. Plant this season or save the water. You can't do both. Plant crops or conserve water, not both. Cities like Phoenix are building desalination plants hundreds of miles from the ocean because every local source is maxed out. And Canada. Canada holds nearly 20% of the planet's fresh water. Lakes that stretch like inland seas, rivers fed by glaciers that won't stop flowing for centuries, wetlands that purify entire ecosystems. From an American perspective, especially from the perspective of a governor watching reservoirs evaporate, Trump's idea didn't sound aggressive. It sounded logical. But in Canada, Those same words triggered something deeper than policy disagreement. They awakened a fear that's been dormant since the 1960s when American engineers first floated the idea of continental water sharing. The fear that economic power, when combined with environmental desperation, can override sovereignty faster than any military threat. Mark Carney understood that dynamic instantly, and his response wasn't just political, it was strategic. Carney didn't rise to prime minister by accident. Before entering politics, he ran the Bank of Canada, then the Bank of England. He spent decades navigating financial crisis where nations with leverage use that leverage to extract concessions from nations without options. He knows exactly how resource dependency works, and he knows that once you start selling water, you lose control of the price, the volume, and eventually the decision itself. So when Trump framed Canada's water as a faucet, Carney framed it as sovereignty. Here's what he said in the days following that initial refusal. Once a country begins treating water as an exportable product, it risks losing the authority to decide how that resource is used. Trade agreements take over. Corporate interests take over. International law takes over. And what was once a public trust owned by citizens and protected by government becomes a commodity governed by market forces. He went further. He warned that if water becomes a global trade product, the world enters a system where access to clean water turns into a privilege for those who can afford it. Poor regions become dependent on international markets to meet a basic human need. And in that system, water stops being a right and becomes a financial asset. That warning landed in Washington like a diplomatic grenade because Carney wasn't just talking about Canada. He was talking about the future of American water policy. And if you've ever wondered what real sovereignty looks like when tested by the world's most powerful nation, you're watching it unfold right now. Stories like this, where power dynamics shift overnight and traditional alliances get tested. That's what we cover on Canada Next. If you want to stay ahead of these moments before they hit mainstream headlines, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Look at what Carney was really saying. America starts importing Canadian water to fix the drought. Fine. But then what? 6 months later, Canadian ecosystems start showing cracks. A year later, Canada's own reserves look shakier than anyone predicted. What happens when a future Canadian government decides that domestic needs come first? America would be locked into dependency on a resource it can't control, with no backup plan except to accept whatever terms Ottawa sets. From Carney's perspective, that's not cooperation, that's surrender. And he made it clear that Canada would rather invest billions in domestic conservation than become the continent's water supplier. But across America, Trump's supporters heard Carney's refusal very differently. They didn't hear sovereignty. They heard selfishness. Policy groups in Washington started circulating feasibility studies, massive infrastructure projects, pipeline networks modeled after the oil industry, systems capable of moving millions of gallons daily from Canada's northern rivers to the American Southwest. Engineers called it cooperative flow. Economists called it mutual benefit. Canada could earn revenue. America could solve its crisis. Everyone wins. Except Canadians don't see it that way. For them, water isn't measured in gallons or priced in contracts. It's woven into national identity. Selling it feels like giving away part of what defines the country. And every time an American voice describes Canada's water as underutilized or suggests that abundance creates an obligation to share, it reinforces the fear that this isn't about partnership. It's about pressure. That's the divide Trump's comments exposed. One nation sees water as a resource that can be moved, traded, and optimized. The other sees it as a sacred trust that must be protected, not sold. And neither side is entirely wrong. The American West is facing a crisis that conservation alone won't solve. Populations are growing. The temperature keeps climbing. Rainfall keeps dropping. Every single projection says the same thing. Supply can't keep up with demand. Cities start rationing. Farms shut down. Industries that employed tens of thousands just collapse because there's nothing coming through the pipes anymore. That kind of pressure doesn't fade. It builds until politicians have no choice but to find new sources or face constituents who can't turn on their taps. Meanwhile, Canada is dealing with its own version of climate chaos. Glaciers melting faster than scientists predicted 5 years ago. Rain falling into different patterns, different seasons, different volumes. Wetlands that formed over centuries are drying out in a couple of decades. Diverting water southward would accelerate that damage. And unlike economic losses, environmental collapse doesn't reverse itself. Once that ecosystem tips too far, there's no reversing it. It's just gone. So when Carney says Canada's water isn't for sale, he's not playing politics. He's calculating survival. If Canada commits to exporting water before anyone truly understands what climate change is doing to those northern reserves, you're locked into a system that could leave Canadians facing the exact same scarcity crisis America's dealing with now, except it happens 1 generation from now instead of today. Ottawa knows this. That's the case they're making to Canadian citizens, and it's resonating. Polls show overwhelming Canadian opposition to water exports, not just among environmentalists, across every demographic. Conservatives and progressives alike view the idea with suspicion. It's one of the few issues in Canadian politics where consensus exists. Water stays in Canada. But here's the tension that keeps growing. America isn't just asking politely. It's beginning to frame water access as a matter of national security. And when a superpower starts using that language, requests can shift into demands very quickly. Trump's comments might have sounded casual, but they carried an unmistakable undertone. The suggestion that one day America might need help from its neighbor to survive. And if that day comes, will polite refusal still be acceptable? Carney's answer to that unspoken question was definitive. He described water as the foundation of sovereignty itself, the element that ensures a nation can provide for its own people before serving anyone else. In his view, protecting water means protecting independence, and no economic incentive, no diplomatic pressure, no security argument justifies giving that up. That stance has made him a political force in Canada, but it's also made him a target in Washington. American commentators have started questioning Canada's role as an ally. If Canada refuses to help during a crisis, what does that partnership actually mean? Are Canadians willing to watch American cities ration water while Canadian lakes sit untouched? Those questions are designed to create pressure, and they're working, because beneath the policy debate, there's a moral dimension that's harder to dismiss. Should nations with abundance share with nations in need? Or does sovereignty mean the right to say no, even when neighbors are suffering? If this question makes you uncomfortable, you're starting to understand exactly what's at stake here. And if this breakdown between allies concerns you as much as it should, hit that like button, because Canada Next brings you these sovereignty battles the moment they happen, not weeks later when everyone else catches up. Carney's position is that sovereignty isn't selfishness, it's responsibility. A country that can't control its own resources can't guarantee its own future. And once trade begins, momentum takes over. Economic interests dig in, legal frameworks solidify. What starts as emergency aid becomes permanent dependency, and the nation that agreed to help loses the power to stop. That's why Ottawa has been pouring billions into conservation, clean energy, and ecosystem restoration instead of exploring export infrastructure. These programs aren't just environmental policy. They're national defense. Protecting water means protecting independence. And for Canada, that's non-negotiable. But America's crisis isn't slowing down. It's getting faster. Drought spreads, reservoirs drop, political pressure builds. This debate isn't going to fade quietly. It's going to get louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. Both nations are waking up to the same reality. The world just entered a new kind of competition. Not over oil, not over technology, over water, the most essential resource of all. And in that competition, geography matters more than military power. Canada holds the advantage. America needs the supply. And between those two realities, the relationship that defined North American stability for 2 centuries is being tested in ways neither country prepared for. What happens next won't be decided by one speech or one treaty negotiation. It will be decided by how both nations answer a single question. In an age of environmental scarcity, does abundance create obligation? Or does sovereignty mean the right to protect what's yours, even when others are desperate? Mark Carney's answer is clear. Canada's water is not for sale. Donald Trump's response is equally clear. America's crisis won't wait for permission. And between those two positions, the future of North American partnership hangs in the balance. For those watching closely, this is where the map gets redrawn. Not through war, not through treaties, but through the quiet recognition that in the 21st century, control over fresh water will determine which nations thrive and which nations beg. Canada just made its choice. America is about to make its own, and the rest of the world is watching to see what happens when the closest allies on Earth discover they can't agree on the most basic question of all. Who owns the water, and who decides what happens to it?